The U.S. is hurting in many ways. Now is the time for realism, not old-fashioned chest thumping. Maybe, just maybe, if we are honest about our situation, we can begin to fix it. Pumping ourselves up is not going to help. What we urgently need now is a reality check. If we can accept the soul of America has been lost in a silent coup d'etat, we will have a much better chance of winning it back. But that sort of progress will require a mass awakening and some bold action to free ourselves from the control structure whose grip becomes more and more suffocating every day. When I was growing up, we used to hear about the wealthy, developed world and how the U.S. was at the head of the pack. We saw ourselves as the best and proudest country. We were the leaders of the free world. After that top group came the communist countries, followed by what was called back then the developing world. Later this term was thought to be an insult. No country wanted to be stuck in a category called developing. It made them sound retarded, as if they would never catch up. So they came to be called the third world. And later still, we called them LDCs, or lesser developed countries. And today, emerging countries. Do we now need a new category, a group called the decaying nations, to reflect the changing reality? If so, the USA must be the leader of this once proud group of countries, those now in serious decline. I am an American. I am still proud of the values that I grew up expounding. I still believe in the virtues of a free economy, competitive markets, a free press, and the moral basis of our society. It saddens me to see that America today appears to have lost its soul, and we have a culture which no longer respects these positive old-fashioned virtues. The U.S. media will not tell you the truth. The America of the 1960s and 1970s no longer exists. The big change, the decay, began with the assassination of President Kennedy. It was not a lone assassin that did it. Almost no one believes that official story that Oswald acted on his own. Not anymore. Too many inconvenient truths have trickled out. In fact, it now seems likely that Lee Oswald did not even fire a shot. He was a patsy, as he tried to tell us before Jack Rubenstein shot him dead, in front of the television cameras, robbing the world of its best witness against the official lie. Around JFK swirled a team of assassins, working for a web of vested interests. All of them wanted Kennedy out of the way. He was threatening their interests. The actual assassin might have worked for Texas oil men, mafia gangsters, or even for CIA insiders. Yes, many of this last group were still upset about JFK's reaction to the failed Bay of Pigs invasion. He was shutting down the American practice of making dangerous foreign interventions. The actual culprits may have been any one of these, or even some combination of all three. Whomever did the deed, it is pretty clear now that the FBI and Lyndon Baines Johnson worked together to cover it up. The truth did not come out in time to catch the villains, and many innocent victims to JFK's shooting have been quietly eliminated to keep the secrets hidden. The cover-up of JFK's assassination has worked for many decades, and those who planned it were never brought to justice. Most of them have now passed on. But the impact of that failure of justice for that very horrific act goes on and on. JFK's demise began the big moral decline of America. Worst of all, the success of that operation made bold those who did the planning. With Lyndon in charge, there was no moral force to stop the abuses. Eisenhower had warned about the military-industrial complex. JFK actually tried to stop them. After Kennedy was gone, under Lyndon, they thrived. A war in Vietnam was pumped up, and the makers of the implements of war profited mightily. The military-industrial complex has ever since run amok. In those dark days of Vietnam War, Americans began to protest. At first, it was the students. Eventually, the anti-war feeling spread across the country until a majority saw clearly that their own lives and the future of their country was threatened. They got off their sofas. I remember, I was one of the students who took to the streets. My college life was disrupted by demonstrations and students occupying university buildings. I can still recall protest flags being draped outside the windows of a building in the middle of the main yard of the college. For many days, I walked the campus, wondering what would become of my class schedule. But this mattered less than ending the war. The mass protests spread across the country and were strong enough to stop a war and end the draft. Enough Americans of all ages were fed up that politicians saw their careers would be in danger if they went on supporting the war. So, the Vietnam War ended with a negotiated pullout of U.S. forces. This was a blessing, but it also proved to be a relief to the powers that be. The shift to an all-volunteer army took the wind out of the sails of the student protest movement. The war in Vietnam ended. But all the wars did not cease, not for long. That momentum in the 70s was strong enough that even President Nixon was pushed out of office. Some say that he was plotting a coup d'etat that would have put him at the head of a dictatorship. Neither the white hats inside our government nor the substantial number of wealthy and powerful families who were not behind Nixon wanted to see Tricky Dick as a dictator of America. So a third-rate burglary was pumped up into a serious crime, and eventually Congress swung into action. Nixon found himself impeached, and he resigned, climbing into a helicopter and leaving the White House before justice could catch up with him. A secret deal must have been done, because his successor soon pardoned him. Gerald Ford became president. This was the same guy who on the Warren Commission had rubber-stamped the implausible magic bullet theory. The real power brokers who stay behind the scenes must have thought they had found the ideal puppet. Unfortunately for them, Ford did not have the stature of a president. After less than 3 years, where he was seen as a fumbling interim president, he was voted out, replaced by Jimmy Carter. The man from Plains, Georgia, was probably the most honest president we have had since JFK. But he was an outsider who was not skilled at pulling the levers of power in a highly political place like Washington. Today, some say he was underrated, but the truth is, he has proven to be a more successful ex-president than he was a president. He never really knew how to run the complex machinery of government. And the powerful war makers who bought and sold congressmen and senators did not like his peaceful instincts. In recent years, Carter has made some devastatingly honest remarks about the role of Israel and the failure of democracy in the U.S. In the middle of last year, he was widely quoted for saying, "America has no functioning democracy." He is right. Those in Congress are not responsive to the will of the people. What is new in the last year or two, though, is a growing number of people are becoming very aware how our political system has been hijacked. Once again, as we saw back in the 1970s, the pressure for change is building. I'll say more about this later. After the failure of Jimmy Carter to change the government and make it work, the Republicans came back into power. Ronald Reagan promised a small government, one that would get out of the way of the people. His words sounded heartfelt, as if he meant them, and he probably did. In his campaigns and while president, he delivered some memorable speeches and won for himself the title of the Great Communicator. But Reagan could not get out of the way of an assassin's bullet. Although he survived the shot fired by John Hinckley, that event changed the country. After that fateful scare, Reagan left much of the governance of the country to his vice president, George H.W. Bush. A former CIA head, Bush knew where the power was, and the strings, both public and private, were very much in his hands. He got much done, for good and for bad. Among other initiatives, he pushed the Star Wars program, which Reagan helped to sell. This helped to foster a mighty growth of secret programs and black operations. One program that went awry and got uncovered was what has become known as the Iran-Contra affair. This was one of those complex schemes that seems typical of black programs. The plot was hatched, supposedly to free American hostages, and Israelis, as usual, were part of the complex plan. In violation of an arms embargo, the U.S. government sold arms to Iran, with Israel acting, that's Mossad, part of Israel, acting as a hidden agent handling the shipment. Part of the illegal scheme was uncovered, and so the schemers changed the flow of funds and got money diverted to fund Nicaraguan Contras. When the plans came to light, a colonel called Oliver North got hauled in front of a U.S. congressional investigation. North gave a great performance at the hearing and managed to win over a compliant Congress, as well as much of the American public, who were then very naive about the many creative schemes used to fund black ops. There were rumors, which are ongoing, that the U.S. has been involved in narcotics trade to fund its secret operations. How much Reagan knew, and when he knew it, was a subject of discussion on the floor of Congress. Reagan was believed to only know about the Nicaraguan part of the plan, and he was a public supporter of the Contras. The involvement of the then Vice President Bush was lightly examined, and it seems probable that he would have a great knowledge and much greater involvement than Reagan. However, Ronald Reagan was called the Teflon president because nothing stuck to him. And in this case, his superpower seems to have extended to his vice president as well. The public's memory proved short. At one time, the scandal was thought to make Bush unelectable, but he went on to win the nomination unopposed, and then went on further to beat Michael Dukakis in the 1988 election. That made a rare 3 consecutive victories for the Republicans. A good economy and a stable international stage were seen as assets that made this near miracle possible. This achievement allowed the black operations to go on growing, and it is probably true that this was a period of thriving growth for what we now believe to be the secret space program. A noteworthy moment came in September 11, 1991, when then President Bush gave a speech extolling the virtues of what he called the New World Order. A transcript of the speech is included in the notes to this video. Part of it goes, "We are Americans, part of something larger than ourselves. What is at stake is something more than one small country. It is a big idea, a new world order." So said Bush in this speech. But he wrapped his naked global ambitions in some empty platitudes about freedom and the rule of law. However, where do those concepts stand today as a possible triumph of New World Order values has moved ever closer? All I see is rich psychopaths abusing power more and more nakedly. In the election, which came a year later, we saw something remarkable. For the first time in decades, there was a solid third-party candidate. This was Ross Perot. He had the credentials and the personal fortune needed to mount a serious presidential campaign. He was the founder and chairman of EDS and was very wealthy and also a true American patriot. The issues that inspired him to get into politics were the mismanagement of the U.S. economy and war veterans who had been left missing in action in Vietnam, as well as his suspicions that illegal narcotics trade was being used to finance off-budget military activities. His refreshing and sensible approach to discussing these issues won him a great deal of popular support. In some polls in the summer of 1992, he was actually ahead of both candidates from the two major parties. But his support faded in the home stretch. In November 1992 election, he won just 19% of the popular vote, with much of his support coming from the middle class. It may have been, though, that this was enough to push the Republican vote down and allow the Democratic candidate, William Jefferson Clinton, to defeat the Bush re-election bid. Clinton won 43% to 37.5% for Bush. Perot remained in the public eye long after the election, and he campaigned again in 1996 when he denounced the NAFTA agreement, saying famously that the giant sucking sound that people heard was the sound of American jobs going south to Mexico. The poor state of the economy in our present times leaves many people thinking that Ross Perot was right. The vast majority of the economic policies of the past 2 decades have benefited only the elites at the expense of the middle class. Certainly, we would have a different country today if Ross Perot had fulfilled his early promise and won the election of 1992. Actually, the middle class did not feel those changes straight away during the Clinton years. The upper tiers benefited most, but middles were still doing better year to year. So most recall Clinton with a certain fondness. However, the reality is that NAFTA and other policies that were implemented at that time took some years to show their full impact. At this point, I want to ask people to look at some charts showing incomes. There has been very little growth in real income for those in the middle for the 34 years from 1967 to 2011. During that time, the top bracket at the 95th percentile level have enjoyed 66% growth in their real incomes. Meanwhile, those stuck in the middle at the 50th percentile are up only 19%. And the middle has done even a bit worse than those at the 10th percentile, who are up 25%. Even worse Since the year 2000, median real incomes, that's at the 50% level, have fallen by 8% up to last summer. No wonder so many of the middle-class citizens are today unhappy. If you take into consideration the rising tax burden on the middle class, you can see that most are actually worse off now than they were 3 or 4 decades ago. In fact, for many, with house prices down and stock prices volatile, their wealth has actually fallen as they have grown older and approached retirement. No wonder so many Americans are worried and fear for their future and the future of their country. Today, many scratch their heads, and they see a world that has changed dramatically, and they wonder, how did we get here? They feel that their futures are threatened by declining wealth, and they see others, the 1%, getting more wealthy every year. They also see that those in power do not care about their welfare. The politicians only care for the wealthy who donate large amounts to their campaigns. Meantime, America seems to be engaged in constant wars. The mainstream press is doing nothing but lying, selling advertising, and supporting the present system. In part 2, I will turn into a deeper analysis of what has brought about these unhappy changes. Thanks for listening. See you again in part 2.